part of these conversations and part of the events that we do here is to create this sense of solidarity, so people don't feel like they're alone. Because once you feel alone, you get quiet. And once you get quiet, all bets are off. So I really think this is a great opportunity for us to continue to make connections with people and continue to stand up for, I think, what most of us would like to see upheld in this country. I said, at the very least, free speech. That seems to be a very strictly fine. So anyway, I appreciate everyone being here this early in the morning, and I was really thrilled to see when Josh accepted the invite to come and speak about Zionism. When I tell people because people are always skeptical, like, who's going to speak about this, because they want to know. When I said Josh Ruebner, I said, oh yeah, that's great. He's fantastic. So you have a lot of street cred out there. I just want you to know that. So I was gonna read Josh's short bio because I think you all should know it. Give me 1 second. So this is the last of this series of Sunday morning cafes. We want to start up a new series, probably 2 or 3 weeks from now. I want to talk because Badi and I are the ones that started this kind of conversation. So I want to talk with her and see what general topical. This series was about big topics. Like we had one on Palestine, we had one on Syria, we had one on Russia. We had one on, I think it'd be interesting to have one maybe on resistance movements. I want to learn more about the Houthis. I want to learn more about Hamas. I want to learn more about Hezbollah. I want to learn more about these resistant movements that sometimes made a difference. I want to add one more story before we start here. I was at the South African Embassy, ironically, last Thursday. And Ibrahim Rasool, I guess maybe you all have heard the news. He's been termed a persona non grata by Marco Rubio, the head of the state in this country, and has been asked to leave. I think he may have already left because he had like 72 hours, I think they give him to pack up his bags and go. Ibrahim Rasool is the ambassador from South Africa to the United States, and really quite a diplomat. He's an incredible human being, very, very, very capable and very good at what he does. He had a speech that I think disparaged white supremacy and was targeted by this administration to get him out. But anyway, at the event, the conversation was about art and activism. And they had John Connie. John Connie was the actor in the Black Panther. He was the King T'Chaka. If any of you saw that movie, a great South African actor, Black, and he was speaking about the role of art and activism. And with him was Patrick Gaspard, who was the head of the Center for American Progress and was also the ambassador to South Africa from the United States during the Obama administration. They both had a very rich conversation about art and activism and how important that is. And there was a CNN moderator. I don't remember her name, not a big name, but someone in there. And she did a pretty good job with it. And came time for a Q&A. And so I happened to be close to the front, so I raised my hand and she called on me and I said, I got up, I thanked them and for the conversation. I said, what do you think the role of BDS is vis-a-vis what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine? And how effective do you think BDS, especially when it comes to cultural boycotts? And there's Jamal. And there's Shelley. We've been waiting for you. You're going to get a tardy. And you may have to stay after class for a minute. But, anyway, so I asked him that question. And also, ironically, there was a big, huge poster of Nelson Mandela hanging behind them. And I reminded the people in the room that this was the terrorist until 2008. Even after he became president, he was still deemed a terrorist until 2008. Anyway, so they answered in a very full-throated way about, yes, you know, that's happened. Well, no sooner they finished, and the moderator was going to go to the next person to answer the question, a person in the front seat jumped off his seat and said, wait a minute, this is totally unacceptable. The fact that they allow this kind of conversation, the fact this is okay, the fact that you answered in the way you do it, and you, Mr. Gaspard, you, because he couldn't go after John Connie, because John Connie is a South African black man, and was going to just let him have it. But he went after the diplomat, thinking that that's his soft way of getting in. And they end up with this kind of full-throated argument back and forth. And I have to give credit to Patrick Gaspard, who stuck to his guns. He did not, you know, give it up, but he became very diplomatic and tried to sort of weave his way into this very difficult minefield that this guy set up for him. Anyway, it went on for like a good 5 minutes, this back and forth. So then the moderator said, I'm going to go to the next question. And as she was going to go, the guy still jumped again and said, wait a minute, I'm not done. And went on to like berate them for what it. By the time they were done with the answer and the back and forth, the event was over. So she said, I'm sorry, we don't have any time for more questions. Wow. So I feel really bad that I might have contributed to. I don't think that happened. I think they planned that way ahead. But anyway, it was interesting to see the kind of you know, limitation of conversation that's taking place, and how I always think that this is a good sign in a way, because obviously what's happening out there and the tide is changing. And I think when that happens, people get very agitated, very uncomfortable. And so we have to keep agitating, we have to keep making people uncomfortable so that we can get to a better place. Josh Ruebner, who's going to be speaking about Zionism today, is an adjunct professor of Injustice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. He received his PhD from the University of Exeter in 2024 in Palestine Studies, and his dissertation is entitled "A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions: The U.S. and the Palestinian Nakba, 1947-1950," which I hope he'll be able to publish it and come and do the book launch here. Yeah. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here. Josh, who's no stranger to Book for the Poets. It's great to have you. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Andy, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here this morning with you all. Thank you all for coming out early on a Sunday morning for Sunday school. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about Zionism. And at the outset, I want to make 3 points about Zionism. The first is that we should view the growth and the establishment of Zionism as a modern day political, intellectual, cultural movement within the context of its time. So if we think about the establishment of Zionism, dating approximately to the early 1880s, when you saw the first flourishing of Zionist organizations in Tsarist Russia to actually establish colonies in Palestine, this took place at a time of huge imperial expansion worldwide and huge colonial expansion worldwide. So when we think about the mid to late 19th centuries in this country, let's put it in its proper context as well. This was, of course, the time of manifest destiny, where the United States was sweeping across the North American continent, removing indigenous Native Americans from their homes in this process, often extremely violently, through massacres, through dispossession. This was the drive of the United States to the Pacific Ocean that culminated in the closing of the American frontier, as it was described. So within the United States, in this time period, we had this concurrent dispossession of the indigenous people here in this country. But also think about what was happening in terms of the US construction of an overseas imperial empire during this time as well, during the advent of modern-day Zionism. So of course, the 1898 Spanish-American War led to all these new imperial possessions in the hands of the United States: Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and of course, the crown jewel in the American imperial experience, which was the Philippines. And if you want to read about the brutality of colonial repression against indigenous peoples, do yourself a favor and read about the brutality with which the United States put down an indigenous Philippine uprising beginning in 1898. So domestically, we had the removal of the indigenous people going on at the same time that we had the construction of empire abroad.
Don't forget Hawaii.
And Hawaii too, right? Although that was a little bit different because that was not taken from the Spanish, right? That was a separate process, but you're right, it was annexed in 1898 as well. So while this was taking place, this domestic expansion of American colonialism, both at home and abroad in the mid to late 1800s, you also had this process echoing on a worldwide basis as well. So think about the years from 1870 to 1910, when you had what was called the Scramble for Africa. Before 1870, do you know the percentage of Africa that was colonized by European powers? Anyone want to take a guess?
10%.
Exactly right. Very good. 10%. Only 10% of Africa was colonized by European powers on the eve of the Scramble for Africa in 1870. At the end of that 40-year period of the Scramble for Africa, you had 7 European countries, let me see if I can rattle them off here: Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany. 8 colonizing 90% of Africa. So at this time when Zionism arose, you also had this concomitant expansion of colonialism in Africa and other places throughout the world. And so the idea of colonial and imperial expansion and the concomitant idea that Europeans were superior over those whom they colonized was an accepted part of European intellectual and cultural development during the time that Zionism arose. Now, this worldwide colonization was not limited only to European powers. We see, for example, Japan at the time, which aspired to modernity in the European sense of the term, also mimicking this process of overseas colonization. And so we saw it, for example, in China at the time, and also culminating in the Japanese annexation and brutal colonization of Korea beginning in 1910. So this was part of a worldwide phenomenon, colonization. So the idea that a European-born movement could generate the notion that European Jews should remove themselves from Europe and establish a Jewish state in Palestine and colonize it in that fashion was something of the regular order of European intellectual thought. So that's the first point I wanted to make about Zionism. The second point that I wanted to make is that we also have to understand Zionism as a special type of colonialism, a type of settler colonialism, which is distinct from the more formal, regular colonialism, right? So when we think about colonialism, for example, we can think about the Dutch presence in what became Indonesia. right? This was not a colonization by the Dutch of Indonesia. There was a very small number of Dutch who actually administered the colony of what was called the Dutch East Indies back then. And the idea was to extract natural resources from what became Indonesia, right? We saw the same process take place with the British in India, where it wasn't really a colonization. The British didn't intend to replace people in India with Brits, right? They just strove to take advantage of the natural resources of that country and turn a profit for the cosmopolitan power. So that's colonialism. Settler colonialism is a much different story. Settler colonialism we're very much familiar with in this country, right? Because this was the process through which Europeans came to colonize North America and to replace and eliminate the indigenous inhabitants of the country. And this is also a global phenomenon, right? We saw it in New Zealand, we saw it in Australia, Canada, with the Spanish throughout Central and South America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the 19th century may not have been a heyday for settler colonialism, but the advance of settler colonialism was also taking place within this context of the establishment of Zionism as an idea in Europe. So let's just look at two examples on the northern and the southern tip of Africa, okay? On the northern tip of Africa, in Algeria, the French colonized and conquered Algeria beginning in 1830. And there were generations of French people who were born in Algeria, and they considered themselves, to all intents and purposes, French Algerians. And did you know that actually France completely annexed Algeria to the metropole, to France itself, so that Algeria was not considered a foreign colony, but it was actually considered a department of France. And French Algerians, but not Algerian Algerians, had the right to vote and to run for French Parliament. And indeed, you had set aside in the French Parliament seats for French Algerians. So it was very much integrated into the French metropole. And this colonization, this settler colonialism by France of Algeria lasted for 132 years, until 1962, until the FLN's successful uprising against the French threw them out at a time of decolonization. So this was happening at the north of the continent. We can also look at other settler colonialisms that took place in Tunisia and Libya as well, though we don't have time to get into everything. Let's also talk about the dynamic at play at the southern tip of the continent, as Andy was talking about South Africa. Of course, Dutch settler colonialism began in South Africa as far back as the 17th century, but it really gained an additional boost when Great Britain itself became the settler colonial power in South Africa in the 1820s and began exporting people to colonize and take over that land. That, of course, also caused a lot of tensions with the Dutch settlers, which was the most vivid example of the inter-European settler colonial war that took place toward the end of the 19th and early 20th century. But I won't get into that because we don't have time for it. But that was the Boer Wars, as they're known. So, lots of advocates of Zionism like to believe that Zionism is sui generis. What does sui generis mean under international law? It means one of a kind, of its own nature, that you cannot compare Zionism to anything else. And this is the second point I want to make, is that that is not true at all. You can definitely understand Zionism within its context of a settler colonial movement that is no different from any other settler colonial movement. And as the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, taught us, the primary purpose of settler colonialism is to eliminate the native. And the elimination of the native can take place under settler colonialism in various different ways. The settler colonizing power can physically remove the indigenous people. The colonizing power can restrict them into ghettos or reservations or Bantustans. These are all different words for a similar process. And of course, the settler colonial power can also exterminate the native and commit genocide against them. So these are all different strategies that the settler colonial power employs to eliminate the native. And we've seen in the course of Zionism and the praxis of the State of Israel, which is animated by Zionism, the deployment of these different tactics at different times throughout history. And maybe we can talk about that later if we have time. The third point I want to make about Zionism at the outset, right? So first, let's view it in this global context of imperial expansion and colonialism in the late 19th century. Number two, let's view it in the specific context of settler colonialism. And number three, let's also understand how Zionism arose as a reaction to the proliferation of anti-Semitism in Europe. And how there's always been this symbiotic relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. So we should view Zionism as a failure of modernity. The emergence of Zionism, its popularization within European Jewish communities should be seen as a failure of modern European society to integrate and assimilate as equal citizens Jewish people. And the development of Zionism as a reaction to this rejection of equality and assimilation. So let me tell you what I'm talking about in particular. I mentioned already that in Tsarist Russia in the early 1880s, you saw the first manifestations of organized Zionist groups. They were called Chovevei Zion, which means the lovers of Zion in Hebrew. They began in the early 1880s, and in 1881, the Tsar, Alexander II, who was extremely reactionary Tsar, was assassinated by left-wingers. And this triggered a huge wave of pogroms against Jews in Tsarist Russia. Extremely bloody, extremely repressive. This was the same time that we saw these proto-Zionist developments start to take place and a real fervor develop amongst Russian Jews in particular for Zionism. And it should be noted that this was not the only reaction to anti-Semitism that took place in Tsarist Russia. Zionism was never the only thought of Russian Jews for how to respond to this outbreak of anti-Semitism. For example, you had a much larger movement of the Bund, which was a socialist and nationalist Jewish organization that did not aspire to settler colonialism in Palestine. In other words, it saw itself as having a collective national future within Russia itself. And the Bund was always dwarfed the Zionist movement, by the way, in Eastern Europe. The Bund was only put out of existence due to the fact that Hitler's genocide during World War II exterminated all of its supporters, except for the few who made it to the United States. So this was taking place in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, you had a different phenomenon taking place with the Dreyfus Affair, which, as you may know, was the trial in France of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a captain, I believe, in the French military, and he was accused of treason on false grounds and trumped up anti-Semitic charges. And the Dreyfus trial led to this huge outbreak of street anti-Semitism in France. So who happened to be in Paris at the time of the Dreyfus Affair? None other than Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. He was a correspondent for an Austrian newspaper in Paris at the time. And Herzl said to himself, my God, well, he was actually very secular, so he wouldn't have said my God. Herzl said, if this outbreak of anti-Semitism in France can happen in the most liberal European country, the first European country to grant the Jewish people full equality and call for the assimilation of Jewish people into the French body politic, If this terrible thing can happen in France, this terrible thing can happen anywhere. And Herzl came to the conclusion that Jewish people were not safe anywhere in Europe. And as you probably know, he wrote the book Der Judenstaat, which is translated to English as the Jewish State. He founded the first Zionist Congress based on the political plan in his manifesto to establish a Jewish state. Now, at first, Herzl was not wedded to the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. He thought any territory might do. So he looked at British proposals for colonizing Uganda, for example. There were other proposals to colonize near the area of El Arish in the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, and even Argentina. There were all these schemes afoot, but what were called the territorial Zionists won out. And they said, we've named this movement Zionism. Our aim is to establish a Jewish state in Palestine and nowhere else. And this is the stream of thought that won out in the Zionist movement. So this is my third point that I want to make. Zionism arose as a failure of modernity, as a failure of Europe to guarantee the safety and security of Jewish people therein. Okay. I want to share with you a few quotes from some Zionist leaders about how they saw the Zionist movement and how they saw the indigenous Palestinian people whom they sought to colonize and replace. Bless you. This is Theodore Herzl writing to Cecil Rhodes, one of the archetypes of British settler colonialism in this era. His name, Rhodes, was taken for the white settler colonial nation of Rhodesia, exactly, which is today Zimbabwe. So this is what Herzl wrote to Rhodes. You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something very colonial. You, Mr. Rhodes, are a visionary politician or a practical visionary. I want you to put the stamp of your authority on the Zionist plan and to make the following declaration to a few people who swear by it. I, Rhodes, have examined this plan and found it correct and practicable. It's a plan full of culture, excellent for the group of people for whom it is directly designed, and quite good for England, for Great Britain. Now notice what Herzl is doing in this letter to Rhodes. He's unselfconsciously not trying to make the case that Zionism is for the benefit of the indigenous Palestinian population. Although, of course, Zionists would make this claim and continue to make this claim today, that the Zionist movement is bringing to the benighted people of the colonized territory enlightenment and civilization. And this is, of course, something that's also common to all colonialisms. The idea that the colonizing power is bringing progress and civilization and advancement and enlightenment to the benighted colonized people, right? It's an idea that is based on a conception of racial superiority and the inferiority of the indigenous population. So Herzl's letter to Rhodes here doesn't contain any admission of the fact that there is an indigenous Palestinian people living in Palestine, that it's not an empty spot on the map just waiting for this benevolent European colonization, but that it's in fact inhabited. And we see also how Zionism and Herzl laid the basis, the genesis, for the idea of transferring, removing Palestinians from their home in his diary. So publicly, in his letter to Rhodes, Herzl acts as if the Palestinian people don't exist. But in the context of his own personal plans in his diary, which became the plans of the Zionist movement, Herzl is more explicit. Here is what he writes in his diary. I believe this was from 1895. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our country. The property owners will come over to our side, Herzl wrote. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. So here you have an acknowledgement by Herzl, the founder of Zionism, that Zionism could only be successful through the removal of the indigenous Palestinian population. And indeed, it could not be otherwise. It could not be otherwise. Because listen to what another Zionist leader wrote about his first trip to Palestine. This is Achad Ha'am, which means the pen name, meaning one of the people. His real name was Asher Ginsburg. And this is what he wrote to his fellow Zionists after visiting the land of Palestine, which he calls the land of Israel, in this letter. The letter is called The Truth About the Land of Israel. Listen to how explicit and real he is here. We who live abroad are accustomed to believe that almost all of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is now uninhabited desert, and whoever wishes can buy land there as he pleases. But this is not true, Achad Ha'am says. It is very difficult to find in the land cultivated fields that are not used for planting. And not only peasants, but all rich landowners are not selling good land so easily. We who live abroad are accustomed to believing that the Arabs are all wild desert people, who like donkeys neither see nor understand what is happening around them. But this is a grave mistake. The Arab, like all the Semites, is sharp-minded and shrewd. The Arabs, especially the urban elite, see and understand what we are doing. But they keep quiet and pretend not to notice anything. For now, they do not consider our actions as presenting a future danger to them. But if the time comes that our people's life in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, will develop to a point where we are taking their place, either slightly or significantly, the natives are not going to just step aside so easily. And because of Achad Ha'am's realization that Palestine was not an empty land, but that it was cultivated and loved by the indigenous people who lived on that land, Muslims, Christians, and the pre-Zionist Jewish community of Palestine. There was simply no land for the Zionist movement to colonize without expropriating the land from its current inhabitants, dispossessing them, and removing them. And he further understood that if the Zionist movement sought to do just that, the Zionist movement would encounter fierce resistance from the Palestinian people. And why wouldn't they encounter fierce resistance? Do we know of any example in the history of the world where there was a settler colonial movement that was able to take over the indigenous people's land without resistance? There is no case of this happening. In all cases, the indigenous population resisted being moved off their land, and why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Why would they want to just give up their land for a foreign settler colonial movement? So, Achad Ha'am makes note in this letter that Palestinians were understanding of the goals of the Zionist movement, but not necessarily thoroughly troubled by it at this point. And the reason is because as long as Palestine remained under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Muslim Empire that governed Palestine for 4 centuries before the British conquered it from them, the ability of the Zionist movement to actually establish a presence in Palestine was extremely limited. The Ottoman Empire did not look favorably upon land sales to the Zionist movement. And so any land sales that needed to be enacted were not necessarily wide-scale in nature. And the number of Zionist colonizers coming to Palestine during the last decades of the Ottoman Empire were not that great. There was only a few dozen, let's say like three dozen, about 35,000. I'll put it that way, 30 to 35,000 was the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine during these years. And actually, many Palestinians didn't view this Zionist colonization as different from contemporary Christian European colonization of Palestine that was occurring at this time. This was also the time of the German Templar movement, right? So all of the German colonies that you have today in Palestine, Israel, were because of this Christian German colonization, which took place at the same time. You have a German colony in Haifa, you have a German colony in Jerusalem, you have German outposts scattered throughout the Galilee, okay? So Palestinians didn't necessarily view this Jewish Zionist colonization as something separate from this Christian Christian colonization, which was also taking place at the time. So, what changed the dynamic? What changed the dynamic was World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain taking over Palestine in a series of military battles between 1917 and 1919. Great Britain placed Palestine under military occupation, and it was later awarded a mandate from the new League of Nations to govern Palestine. We can talk more about that if we have time, but I don't want to go on for too long. Written into the terms of the League of Nations mandate that was given to Great Britain to rule Palestine was the exact wording of the Balfour Declaration. You're probably familiar with the Balfour Declaration and its call for establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. So now this British commitment made to the Zionist movement was now written into the terms of the League of Nations mandate to Great Britain for ruling Palestine. And indeed, for the 30 years that Great Britain ruled Palestine, it made sure to prioritize the goals of the Zionist movement at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian people. So, for example, it allowed, for most of the time of the 3 decades of the British Mandate, Jewish immigration into Palestine. It also allowed it to be very easy for Jewish people who came under Zionist colonization to gain Palestinian citizenship, while making it very difficult for Palestinians who happened to be abroad during World War I from getting their citizenship, by the way. And of course, the British mandate also allowed for representation of the Jewish community in Palestine as a quasi-official government body. This was through the Jewish Agency. It also allowed for the establishment of a Jewish Zionist militia, the Haganah, which was defense. So basically, throughout these 30 years of British rule over Palestine, you had Great Britain supporting the establishment of a Jewish state in the waiting. And indeed, the Zionist movement created all the institutions and mechanisms that allowed it very smooth transition from tutelage under the British mandate to independence, which we'll talk about soon. Okay. During the British mandate, we saw the ways in which this Zionist settler colonial praxis played itself out through the creation of exclusionary institutions in Palestine. And this was embodied in 2 different Hebrew terms. One was called kibush ha'avodah, which means the conquest of work. So notice the militarized terms that the Zionist movement used to talk about the colonial project in Palestine. The idea of kibbutz avodah meant creating a Jewish Zionist economy in Palestine that was not dependent in any way upon the indigenous Palestinian people. So the Zionist movement created exclusionist institutions like the labor union, the Hizbut, which was off limits to indigenous Palestinian people. What kind of labor movement excludes people based on their nationality? Only a racist one does. And so the idea of kibbutz avodah was to deny Palestinians the economic opportunity to continue to live in Palestine under the new economic institutions that were being created by the Zionist movement. The second term I want to familiarize you with is called kibbutz karkaot, which means the conquest of the land in Hebrew. Again, notice the militarized language that's employed by the Zionist movement. Kibbutz karkaot meant that when Jewish National Fund purchased, but this time it was purchasing land, it wasn't stealing land like Israel did in 1948, because they couldn't do that under either the Ottoman Empire or the British Mandate. It had to be legally bought from a landlord. Oftentimes, what do you call that? Absentee landlord. So when the JNF would purchase land in Palestine, it would treat that land as the exclusive purview of Jewish people worldwide. So once land was purchased by the Jewish National Fund, it was alienated in perpetuity from Palestinians. Now, I mentioned how this was often land sold by absentee landlords. Some of them were wealthy Palestinians who didn't live on the land, who lived in Jerusalem or another major city. Some of them were other Arab landlords who lived in Lebanon, for example. But they all had tenant farmers. They all had Palestinians who were rooted on that land, whose families, in many, many cases, farmed that village land for hundreds and hundreds of years. And those Palestinian tenant farmers were uprooted from the land through these land purchases, and they were dispossessed, okay? So it's during this time of the British Mandate that Palestinians do begin to gather more of a sense of trepidation about what the Zionist movement will entail, because they see it growing under the protective wings of the British Empire. And even before the establishment of the British Mandate in 1920, already some perceptive Palestinians understood exactly what was at play. I know you all had Professor Khalidi a few weeks ago, right? Did he tell this story about his great-great-great uncle, Yusuf Dia-Din al-Khalidi? Yeah. This is what he opens his excellent book with, which I saw is out there in the library, 100 Years' War on Palestine. Professor Khalidi's great-great-great uncle, Yusuf Dia-Din, was an accomplished scholar and an administrator in the Ottoman Empire. And in 1899, he wrote a letter to Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. And this is what Yusuf Dia had to say. He said that in principle, Zionism was, quote, natural, beautiful, and just. Who could contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country. And this statement is often quoted out of context by Zionist advocates to show that Palestinians somehow agreed with Zionism. But what they don't bring up is what followed in Yusuf Dia-Din al-Khalidi's letter to Herzl. He says, quote, Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others. It would be, quote, pure folly to take over Palestine. And he concluded his letter to Herzl saying, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. He foresaw generations of struggle and conflict and violence should the Zionist movement attempt to dispossess Palestinians of their land and take over Palestine from the indigenous inhabitants. I also want to share with you a petition that was sent by a Bedouin tribe to the Ottoman Sultan in 1890 about how they were dispossessed through early Zionist land purchases in Palestine. the Zionist movement had purchased a tract of land on what became the city of Rehoboth, which is today one of the top 10, I would say, largest cities within Israel, and one of the earliest Zionist settlements in Palestine. This is what the Bedouins wrote to the Sultan in 1890. They began to expel us from the land we lived on. The farm, which was ours since the times of our fathers and grandfathers, was forcefully taken from us by the strangers who do not wish to treat us according to the accepted norms among tillers of the soil, and according to basic human norms or compassion. In short, they will not accept us even as their slaves. So these were Palestinians who had been dispossessed by this Zionist land purchase and colonization, and who realized that they could not even stay on the land in a subservient manner. The Zionists would not even have them as subhumans, because remember, this was kibusha avodah, the conquest of labor, and kibusha konkolot, the conquest of land. The idea was to exclude Palestinians from any type of labor or land in Palestine once it fell under Zionist control. So during the British Mandate, we saw that Palestinians continually rose up to protest Great Britain transforming its promise of establishing a Jewish national home into fact. We saw repeated Palestinian uprisings against this British policy, which sometimes also targeted the Jewish community in Palestine in 1920, 1921, 1929, 1933, the Izzadin al-Qassam revolt, and 1933 to 1936, which is called the Great Arab Revolt in Palestinian historiography. It was one of the greatest and longest and most sustained campaigns of anti-colonial uprising in the history of the interwar period between World War I and World War II. It started off as a nonviolent boycott and strike, which lasted a full 9 months countrywide until it was broken by Great Britain and other Arab leaders, and thereafter transformed into an armed uprising by Palestinians in the countryside against British rule. And in fact, large portions of the country were lost to Great Britain's control during this Great Arab Revolt. And Palestinians actually controlled and self-governed much of the land, especially in the north and the central portion of the country, during this revolt, which was crushed with brutal force by Great Britain. Great Britain either jailed, exiled, injured, or killed 10% of the Palestinian male population in the course of this uprising. And Great Britain also succeeded in decapitating the leadership of the Palestinian national movement through these arrests and exiles and killings. So that when Great Britain relinquished its mandate over Palestine in 1947 and turned it over to the United Nations to decide the fate of the country, the Palestinian national movement was largely leaderless because it had been decapitated by Great Britain. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar, and if we're not, we can definitely get into more detail later about what took place then. The United Nations recommended partitioning, recommended, not decided, recommended because they didn't have the power to decide, recommended to partition Palestine into 2 states, a Jewish and an Arab state, against the express wishes of the majority indigenous Palestinian people, violating the concept of self-determination for which World War II was supposedly fought. Now, this partition recommendation was never implemented. Instead, we saw the implementation of what the Zionist forces called Plan Dalet, or Plan D. This was a premeditated campaign of ethnic cleansing to drive out of their homes as many Palestinians as possible and to conquer as much land as possible once the British left. And in fact, the ethnic cleansing campaign went into effect even before Great Britain ended its mandate. It really got underway in all seriousness in April of 1948, 6 weeks before Great Britain withdrew from Palestine. You all are probably familiar with the Deir Yassin massacre of April 9th, 1948, either the 9th or the 11th. But this was only one manifestation of this ethnic cleansing campaign. Zionist militias drove tens of thousands of Palestinians from wealthy upscale neighborhoods in Jerusalem. Haifa was depopulated. Jaffa was depopulated of Palestinians. Tiberias was depopulated of Palestinians. Bisan, near the Jordan Valley, was similarly depopulated by Zionist militias. All of this took place before Great Britain had left. Indeed, about half of Palestinian refugees from the Nakba, the catastrophe, were made refugees before Great Britain even left. And this process accelerated after Great Britain did leave, and Israel declared independence in May 1948. So we're all probably familiar with the ways in which Israel continued to depopulate Palestine, conquer territories well beyond what the UN had recommended. And at the end of the fighting in 1949, when Israel signed armistice agreements with Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, as it was called at the time, and Egypt, Israel had conquered more than 3/4 of all of historic Palestine, had ethnically cleansed somewhere between 75 and 85% of the indigenous Palestinian populations from the land it controlled, and refused to allow Palestinians to return to their homes and their properties. This was the historical turning point, the opportunity that the Zionist movement had waited for more than half a century, to execute its plan of transferring Palestinians out of their homes, of depopulating Palestine, of creating a Jewish state. And indeed, there could be no other way to create a Jewish state except through this ethnic cleansing, except through this dispossession. And what do I mean by that? Look at the UN partition recommendation. It's a little known fact that the UN did not recommend creating a Jewish state and an Arab state, even though I said that. In the Arab state, the borders the UN recommended, there would be a virtual homogenous Palestinian Arab population. There would only be something like 10,000 Jewish people in the borders of the Arab state proposed by the UN. But in the so-called Jewish state that the UN proposed, guess what? There was parity, numerical demographic parity between the Jewish community and the Palestinian indigenous community. Within the proposed boundaries of the UN partition plan, there were 498,000 Jewish people and 497,000 Palestinians. So the UN didn't recommend creating a Jewish state. It recommended creating a homogeneous Palestinian state and another binational state. And so the Zionist leaders understood that the only way to create a state with a demographic supermajority of Jewish people was through ethnic cleansing. That's why I said it could be no other way. It had to be ethnic cleansing. It had to be dispossession, both because of the logic of Zionism as a settler colonial movement, and because of the demographic imperatives on the ground, where the Jewish community only constituted 1/3 of the population and owned less than 7% of Palestine. Less than 7%. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we're not going to be able to cover it all, so I'm going to skip ahead. But we've seen for how over the past now more than 75 years, the ideology of the state of Israel has embodied Zionist logic and praxis. The Nakba, the catastrophe that Israel inflicted on the Palestinian people, was not a historic event. It's an ongoing process. This is also something that Patrick Wolf, the scholar of settler colonialism, teaches us about structures of settler colonialism. He says that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. It's not something that happens one time in history, but unfolds as a historical process. So the Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe that Israel is inflicting on the Palestinian people and that we've seen intensify to a degree that is unparalleled ever since October 2023. By the way, Israel in 1.5 years killed at least 3 times as many Palestinians as it did during the Nakba in 1948. We've seen how Israel has continued to inflict this ongoing catastrophe on the Palestinian people. And it won't stop because of the animating logic of Zionism, which is behind every single government of the state of Israel. This is not a left-wing versus right-wing phenomenon in Israeli politics. All Israeli political parties, by law, have to be Zionist in their orientation. Now, some Palestinian parties in the Knesset kind of get around this in a tricky way, but that is what the law is on the books. If you don't declare fealty to Zionism, you can be disqualified from running for election to the Knesset, even if you're a citizen of the state of Israel, including the 20% of citizens of the state of Israel who are Palestinian, who were not ethnically cleansed in 1948. Okay, so let me skip ahead today, and I'll wrap up here. Today we're seeing an incredibly dangerous conflation of criticism of Zionism and criticism of the policies of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. Remember I talked about earlier on how there's always been this symbiosis, this energy between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Both Zionists and anti-Semites see no place for Jewish people anywhere but an exclusionary Jewish homeland, right? So we see how the white nationalist right in this country has embraced Zionism, and they've embraced the policies of the state of Israel. Why? Because this is exactly what they want to create here in the United States. And this is exactly the script that is unfolding in these horrific and terrifying and terrible times that we live in now with the Trump administration. So how does this impact the situation regarding our ability to continue speaking up and speaking out for the rights of the Palestinian people in opposition to Zionism in the state of Israel? One of his very first acts in his second term in office, the president, I hesitate to call him that because he doesn't deserve it, but the president issued an executive order saying that anyone who's found to commit an act of anti-Semitism on college campus who's here on a student foreign visa is to be expelled and deported, and their visas to be stripped away from them. Now let's be very clear about what this means. For the last 2 years in particular, the Republicans, along with a few Democrats, but not most, have been conflating any acts of protest against Israel's genocidal violence in Gaza with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In GOP MAGA minds, there is no way to protest for Palestinian rights that is not an act and a manifestation of anti-Semitism. They think it's all anti-Semitism, right? So Andy talked about the extremely disturbing detention, abduction, disappearance of Columbia University grad Mahmoud Khalil last week. The Trump administration did not even bother to accuse him of committing a crime. The Trump administration put him in an ICE detention facility in Louisiana, 1,300 miles from his 8-month-old pregnant wife, when he should be preparing for the most joyous time in his family's life, welcoming the birth of their first child. Because of a thought crime. because he organized for Palestinian rights on campus. There's not a single accusation by the Trump administration that Mahmoud engaged in anything but First Amendment protected rights to speech and assembly. This is why Mahmoud's detention and abduction and disappearance is so central. Not only for the Palestinian students here on foreign visas who are going to bear the brunt of this Trump administration rage, but because this is a test case, this is a trial balloon, because the Trump administration knows full well that if they get away with disappearing Mahmoud Khalil and engaging in extraordinary rendition, remember that term from the Bush administration? I'm sure you remember it, Dan. If they expel him to another country, then they know that if they can get away with this, that it's only a short step to criminalizing this behavior of all Americans, regardless of our immigration or naturalization or citizenship status. And for those who are trying to keep their head down, like Columbia University, and just saying, oh, well, if we accede to the demands of the Trump administration, everything's going to be okay. No, that is not how you confront a bully. You confront a bully by standing up to that bully and making sure that the bully doesn't take one more inch of ground from you. Columbia University is bending over backwards to placate the Trump administration, and what are they getting? Only more demands. That they put all of their Middle East Studies program under government receivership, government censorship. So the more you give to bullies, the more they take from you. So we cannot give the bully in the White House any of our rights. And for those who think this is only going to affect the Palestine issue, and that's not my cause, I don't care, or it's sad that this is happening to those who are supporting Palestine, guess what? It's not going to stop at Palestine. They're going to come after every single person who is considered a political enemy of their white supremacist nationalist agenda, which I assume means all of us here in this room and almost everyone in this great city of Washington, D.C. So we have to resist this conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, not only because it's the right thing to do as a way to protest and raise our voices on behalf of the indigenous Palestinian people who have been denied their rights under Israeli apartheid, but because this is an extremely dangerous time in American history where we have to use our voices to the greatest extent we can. Thank you. All right, I hope I didn't talk too long.
No, this was a great overview, I think, for most of us in this room. So thank you so much for being so professorial today. It's perfect for this kind of environment. So let's open it up to questions.
Yeah, am I taking them or do you want to take them?
Let me get a microphone. I think there's another walk-around microphone that we can use. Try this.
Okay. No? Yeah? Yeah, it's working. Okay. First of all, I'd like to say
Sorry, I don't think the microphone is on.
this is not.
Oh, yeah, no, that's not.
Just put it
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Okay. First of all, I live on a kibbutz and I now live in Tel Aviv. And I found, and I define myself as a left-wing socialist Zionist. Hashmat Sayer, that's my background. And I found your talk really very illuminating. I agree with many of the points.
Put it close to your mouth, please.
Yeah, I agree with many of the points that you made. And I'm hoping that all of your quotes and statistics are in your book. Yeah, so, okay.
Most of them are in a previous book I wrote called Israel, Apartheid, or Democracy or Apartheid State. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, I have a number of comments, but I have one basic question. I say my belief and my colleagues' belief is.
Yeah.
Okay. My belief and my colleagues' belief is in the mutual right to national self-determination for both Jews and Palestinians, etc. And when you talk about the first point of settler colonialism in the European context, there's, I believe, one basic difference between the Zionist movement and all of the other movements, which was that the Zionist movement was the only one which was returning to a place where the Jews once had sovereignty, whereas all of the others, the United States and Canada and Latin America, et cetera, they weren't going back to where they had ever had a place. So how do you relate to that difference, to that comment?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you for sharing your personal background. You know, it's interesting during the Nakba in 1948, National Rights that year, even though it was on the very left wing of the Zionist spectrum, it was still one of the largest beneficiaries of the expropriation of Palestinian lands. And they actually did not protest it. In fact, they kind of eagerly took on these new lands and added it to the Shemeretz that people see. But yeah, you raise a good point. And you know, I said that Zionism was not sui generis, there was not one of its kind. But you're right, that there is this added angle that does, in this one respect, make Zionism different as a settler colonial movement from other settler colonial movements. And, you know, I think it's ahistorical for people to deny the Jewish historical, religious, and even political connection to the land of Palestine. And, you know, it's very interesting reading through the debates of 1947 when Palestinians actually had representation at the United Nations through what was called the Arab Higher Committee. And they laid out their vision for what they wanted to see a post-British independent Palestine look like. And in these proposals, the Palestinian representatives recognized this Jewish historical, cultural connection to the land of Palestine and recognized that Jewish people were an integral part of that history. And you know, if you look at the history of Palestine during the Ottoman Empire, I mean, look, a lot of people like to look back at that and kind of like through rose-colored lenses and kind of sugarcoat it. I mean, it was far from a perfect situation. But the reality was that Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted and cohabited in Palestine under the framework of the Ottoman Empire.
There's a live comment by Professor Nachman which describes that.
Okay, wonderful. I haven't read that particular one, but I read another one by Michelle Campos, who's a professor at Penn State. It's called Ottoman Brothers, and it's about the way in which Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Palestinians in Palestine at that time contested the parliamentary elections. So yeah, of course there is that connection. I don't think anyone should deny it because I think it makes sense. Unserious analysis. So I can definitely hear this.
Thank you, Josh. Nice to see you in the family here today. And with us, I just want to mention this is a very informed audience, so I just want to let you know that the Trump wall is also trying to take over the DC Bar Association. I don't know if anyone's heard about that, but one of our candidates for president of the bar is Brian Bondi, and he's Mike Bondi's brother. And it's fairly obvious, and so we need to spread the word and stop the package and two candidates for DC Bar, which would ever see licensing and so that's a very important thing to see. Second of all, in terms of other historical parallelism, you look at the India-Pakistan partition. I don't know if I don't want to sidetrack, but does that show why that seems to work for those studies?
Yeah, that's actually part of my dissertation. Because in the post-World War II period, you had a number of territorial partitions. Right? It wasn't only South Asia, Korea was divided up at the time. Germany was divided up. The Dutch
wanted to divide up what became Indonesia. And I'm sure I'm missing a few examples that escaping right now. So partitioning territory along the two national sides was very much in the air after World War II. The really cataclysmic and horrifying partition of the South Asian continent. It's estimated to 1 million people as a result of that partitioning and the cleansing of transfer populations that went along with it. Was something that was very supported by the United States. The United States felt that they did knowledge about South Asia.
Was willing to defer to Great Britain. And Great Britain very, very hastily drew up these partition lines, exactly in the same way that the partition lines were drawn up by the United Nations in 1947. In fact, one of the things I found in my dissertation was an oral history interview by one of the State Department officials who was told by Ralph Bunche. Is Ralph Bunche on here, Andy?
No, he's not actually.
Okay.
He's in our Hyattsville location.
Okay, so I don't know, you may want to consider whether you still want Ralph Bunche on the wall after this story.
Right, exactly. I remember the story. I'm thinking about it.
So there was this Swedish guy who was the head of UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine. He always carried around colored pencils in his breast pocket. And so one night, Ralph Bunche took these colored pencils and he drew lines for where he thought Palestine should be partitioned. And it was so rushed and so unthought through that he actually wound up dividing village land from village land. So, you know, the British partition of South Asia was done in a similarly rushed manner that was not well thought out. There's another tie, because one of the members of UNSCOP was an Indian judge. If I remember correctly, his name was Sir Abdul Rahman. He was a Muslim Indian who was opposed to the partitioning of the South Asian subcontinent. And he saw, during the time of UNSCOP, the cataclysm that was unfolding. And so this Indian delegate to UNSCOP, who saw the cataclysmic partitioning of South Asia, was the one to put forward the intellectual idea behind the minority report of UNSCOP, which was not to partition Palestine, but was to have it as two federated states instead. So there is a lot of interconnection and interplay between those partitions as well. portions of Syria, portions of what's today Jordan as well. So there have been those ambitions there. There have been times in which Israel has occupied large portions of Lebanon for extended periods of time, up to the Litani River, which is usually considered like a geographical divide of what Israel wants. In terms of wanting those waters and the headwaters, in Syria that are necessary for those kind of like geo-hydraulic concerns. It's also worth mentioning that when Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967, it annexed it formally in 1980. That annexation was not recognized by anyone until the Trump administration. Sovereignty did not extend to the totality of what we think of as Palestine, Israel today. So I told you I'd embarrass myself if I went back to the Bible, but even when you think about the biblical stories that we're familiar with, like Samson, for example, right? He's captured by the Philistines, who have their empire based in what's today Gaza, right? So there are always these like competing political entities within Palestine. And so, look, that's part of history. But just because that was part of history, does that provide a justification for people who are Jewish today to seek to establish and maintain an exclusionary state in a country at the expense of the indigenous population who's being oppressed? No, of course it doesn't. It doesn't admit for that in any circumstance. I mean, analogize it to the Roman Empire, right? If we want to go back millennia, okay? Does an Italian American today have the right to found a political movement to reestablish the Roman Empire and to claim that because 2,000 years ago, my ancestors lived in Carthage, I have a right to colonize Tunisia. So Carthage is Tunis, right? I have a right to colonize Tunisia and set up an exclusivist Italian state in Tunisia for the benefit of all Italians worldwide because we once had political sovereignty there. Of course not. If we try to reset the political checkerboard and go back to where we were millennia ago and base modern day political claims off of the territorial arrangements that existed back then, everyone would have claim to everything. We'd all be mixed up and jumbled up. It makes no sense. And of course, under international law, forget the historical analogies, under international law, everyone has the right to self-determination. There is no right to come in and colonize and take away someone's land under international law. The opposite is true, that indigenous people facing settler colonial violence have the right to arm themselves and to fight back against this violent dispossession. That's the reality of international law. It provides much more for the colonized than it does for the colonizer.
It's gonna be bloody in Greenland, man.
And thanks, Josh, this is really terrific, very informative, I really appreciate it. I'm Diane Perlman, and I'm a clinical and political psychologist. So like a few reflections and then like an issue that I want to deal with about Zionism now. I spent my junior year at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, 1970 and 71. And I remember at the time, there was a lot of conscious thought that, like, what will we do without anti-Semitism? And that we need anti-Semitism to exist. And at the time also, I remember like young men felt ashamed and humiliated about Jews walking to their slaughter, which isn't entirely true. And this sort of, so I need to understand, I'm working on analyzing things psychologically and also how to demystify and intervene during this period of mass hysteria and denial and identity issues and how to communicate that. Anyway, then, and there also, I worked on books, and there were like these young Germans that came to volunteer out of penance for the Holocaust. And then I went to the Dachau, and Soviet Jewry was a bit, then I went to the Soviet Union to visit refugees, and I got expelled from the Soviet Union. Anyway, so today, Zionism is radioactive term. And there's all kinds of anti-Zionism, post-Zionism, and including like talking with family members. So they say like Zionism means, if you don't believe in Zionism, it means you don't believe that Jews can have a safe home. And there are Jews who call themselves Zionists who believe in Palestinian rights. So anyway, I'm trying to think of other, there's like anti-Zionism, there's post-Zionism. And also, I've been going to Congress with Doctors Against Genocide, and I often say, like, what's going on now, this is not anti-Semitism, this is a very different phenomenon. My predominant emotion is horror, as this is from horror at witnessing what's going on, so I think of other terms like Zionophobia. Anyway, so I'm interested in your thinking about, like, language and how to communicate people who feel defensive and threatened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thanks for that question, Diane. A couple of points I want to make. One, anti-Semitism is a very real historical and contemporary phenomenon. We're all familiar with how that played out in Europe, resulting in the Nazi genocide. But it's also a very real phenomenon today within the United States and in other countries as well. But let's be very clear about where the anti-Semitism is coming from. It's coming from the white nationalist MAGA base that is the one who brought Trump to power. And it was a right-wing white nationalist who went into a synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 13 people at worship a few years ago.
That was for helping immigrants, because Jews were helping.
Right. This is all part of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of people who believe in this, because this was a synagogue that was welcoming to immigrants. He did a lot of community work to encourage the integration of immigrants into the local Pittsburgh society. That's why they were targeted. right? It's the same type of rhetoric you see from MAGA Republicans in Congress talking about Soros-fueled conspiracies, right? George Soros, the Jewish puppeteer, controls, you know, every left-wing manifestation in the world. It's like rhetoric that's like straight out of the Nazi playbook. So, you know, these are very real manifestations of anti-Semitism that are happening. I mean, let's not forget that in Charlottesville, Virginia, a bastion of liberalism and progressivism, just a few years ago, you had neo-Nazis marching down the downtown streets with tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us, and running their car into Heather Heyer and killing her, one of the counter-protesters. And then Trump saying that they're fine people on both sides, right? So this is the reality that we're dealing with. We are dealing with the fact that there is a very real anti-Semitism in this country. And instead of Republicans actually confronting the fact that it comes from their voter base, their MAGA base, their white nationalist base, instead they project onto the left. And instead they try to displace all this very real anti-Semitism onto youth who are standing up on college campuses and saying, I don't want my tax dollars going to fund the genocide of the Palestinian people. I want the US to hold itself accountable to laws which says we're not supposed to give weapons to countries that commit human rights abuses. That's what they're saying. And you know, the Trump administration and MAGA Republicans have spent so many years demonizing all of this campus protest as anti-Semitism, specifically to try to make themselves look prettier, right? So it is a very real phenomenon. Number two, I would say we also always have to insist that the conflation of Zionism with Judaism is wrong. It is wrong because of this. Now, Zionists cannot have their cake and eat it too. If they insist that Zionism is a manifestation of Jewish self-determination, if they view Israel as their homeland, if they advocate for Israel, and I'm going to say something controversial, but it's true, because there are folks like this. I'm not saying everyone's like this, but there are folks who advocate for Israel above the interests of the United States. Some of them are in Congress. It's not a mystery that this is happening. If you do all of these things, you can't turn around and then say, oh, this is wrong. You know, this is wrong that people are conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Semitism. They're the ones who have conflated it. We're the ones who need to insist on the separation. We're the ones who need to say, thank you, my wife's my training section. We're the ones who need to say Zionism is a political movement and ideology. To be opposed to Zionism is not anti-Semitic. It's not about what you think of Judaism. It's not expressing a hatred towards Jews or bigotry towards Jews who oppose Zionism. It's recognizing that it's a political movement, and it's a political movement that relies upon the erasure, the removal of the indigenous Palestinian people, and it's wrong. Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism, I think, is a pretty bad term to begin with. So I'm not opposed to trying to change that in the discourse. I mean, I think something like anti-Jewish hatred or racism or bigotry, you know, more accurately expresses it.
Violence against Palestinians. It's different from.
You're talking about in the U.S.?
What's going on now, the reactions from since the last 16 months, the increase in hostility against Jewish institutions is completely associated, and also statistically, with witnessing violent horror, witnessing violence against Palestinians.
Yeah, but I would push back on that a little bit because most, not all, most of all of the institutions and businesses that have been targeted have been supportive of Israel, right? And so whether you agree or disagree with the ways in which people protested these particular institutions and businesses, the fact was that it was done on a basis of political expression. So if you don't want people protesting at your synagogue, I would never advocate for anyone to protest, you know, at a Jewish worship, right? But if you don't want protesters showing up at your synagogues, guess what? Don't hold real estate events there where you're selling plots of Palestinian stolen land in the West Bank. You are, by doing that, as the president of the synagogue or the rabbi of the synagogue, inviting just this type of protest. This protest is on a political basis, not on a religious basis. It's on you that you decided to hold this event at the synagogue, not at the people who protested the stealing of Palestinian land.
We have time probably for maybe, actually, one more question because we're past our time. It's 11:10. So if we want, we can do just a quick roundup. I think you have a question, and maybe over there. So we'll go from here to here. Just ask the questions, and then you can.
Yeah, and before we take those final questions, I want to recognize Brian Barber, who's sitting right here. Brian has a great new book out. What's it called again, Brian?
No Way But Forward.
No Way But Forward. Andy has a copy here. It's about the stories of generations of Palestinians in Gaza and their attempts to survive all of these horrific Israeli onslaughts. Brian's going to be giving a book launch talk at the Palestine Center in Foggy Bottom this Wednesday night, I think that's the 19th, at 6:30. And Brian has some cards here that he can pass out. Really, really want to encourage everyone to show up for Brian's book talk because
And
it's
he's been in and out of Gaza 50 times.
We've been to Gaza 50 times. So,
Wow. So looking forward to your book launch, Brian. Okay, so let's take the last ones and I'll combine it all into answers.
keep it short.
You made much about how anti-Semitism had been at the roots of Zionism, but do you think that anti-Semitism was of an extent that was much greater than what other minority groups had ever experienced? I mean, a great example would be the Holocaust. And didn't the Gypsies, by numbers or by proportion, suffer even more than the Jews?
Or slavery.
I have many questions which I will have to ask
The
in
microphone.
time. I'm sorry. Many questions, historical, legal, but you segued an answer to with the legal and political steamrolling in this country, regardless of justification, regardless of history, at this point, what do you suggest? Is there a way to stand in front of that tank, like in Tiananmen Square? There is so much that is hidden. This is the probably least transparent or second least transparent presidential administration. As you implied, there could be policies that are already in effect that the American people don't know about. And in the context of the power of American Jews and across political spectrum, Schumer is one of my targets.
Okay. So to the first question, yes and no. No, Hitler's genocide against the Jewish people was not unique in terms of him also targeting other groups based on their identity. But yes, it was unique in terms of his special hatred and animus toward the global Jewish population, which he believed was the primary and the sole responsible party for all of Germany's miseries after Versailles and the forced disarmament and the reparations payment and the taking of German lands that went along with that peace settlement and the hyperinflation and all that. He believed international Jewry was behind all of that. So while he did target others, he did also have this like exclusive obsession with Jewish people. Now, we saw in history how the type of genocide that unfolded against Jewish people in Europe during World War II was predated by other forms of genocide. The Ottoman genocide against the Armenian people during World War I. And also, if you look, for example, at Germany's colonization of what was then called Southwest Africa, today Namibia, I mean, Germany nearly exterminated every single indigenous person under the control of its mandate that it had there. So these forms of modern day genocidal exterminations were already in place, facilitated by the industrialization of killing that was made possible by the modern world. But yes, Hitler also targeted Roma, as was mentioned. He targeted gay people, he targeted people with physical disabilities. The people with physical disabilities, German Christians, were actually the first ones to be exterminated under Hitler's rule, well before the final solution was put into play in 1942. So, yes and no, in response to your question. In response to your question, I don't have a magic answer, to be honest. We're all just getting steamrolled, as you mentioned, and we're all drinking from a fire hose of crises that we have to respond to that are targeting different communities. I mean, I would say everyone has a role, right? Everyone has a role that they can play. You know, some people can write, some people can speak, some people can organize, some people can go to protests, some people can lobby their members of Congress, some people can engage in forms of mutual aid, some people can shelter immigrants in their churches or what have you, to try to prevent them being dragged away from ICE, by ICE. We all have our role to play, we all have our own lane. I think what's most important is for each of us to understand like how we can contribute and how we can engage in collective action to meet the challenges, the very dangerous challenges of this moment.
Just, and I didn't mean to imply that you were going to be our savior, but I'm looking for, you know, we've all been on that path of we contribute what we can. We talk to our constituencies if we can. But I'm getting more panic and more alarmed, especially because of what I know I don't know.
I think the most important thing is not to give up, because I think that's really what ends up happening sometimes with these. You get exhausted and you just shut down. You just move away. And we don't want to do that. And part of the reason why we continue doing these type of programs is really to keep the flame going, because there's a movement and it's really rising. And yet, you know, the higher we rise, the harder they try to come down. So there's a sense of that their side is bigger, but they have the power in their hands, and I get it, and it feels bigger, but the people are really on, I think, the side of justice, and they see it, and they see the injustice, and I think that's the hope we have, is the fact that it's becoming so transparent that it's hard to ignore anymore. It's hard to ignore that they're overreaching and they're really kind of taking away many rights. I mean, when you see how many members of Congress vote to free?
110, I believe.
110 members
now.
of Congress have signed on this letter to free Khalil, and to say that that's unprecedented in many ways. So I think those types of things are really having an impact.
Well, on the mall, 5,000 people were there on Friday afternoon, and then yesterday, CNN, Fox News had large numbers, over 1,000, I would say, there. And at Heritage right now, there's another mobilization. All of these formed with groups I never even heard of before. So there's a lot of movement from all over the country, and finding out about it and trying to put them together, or maybe not put them together, but a free-for-all. Just raise hell wherever you can.
I think movements are just popping up everywhere. I'm always amazed at anything. I think, I wish I could be there, and all of a sudden I'm looking and there are people there that are doing it, you know, so it's important. And also, I think we have to also push ourselves a little bit more, and not say, well, you know, Anna's gonna take care of this, and kind of move away, you know. That's as an easy out, I think, for many of us. And yes, these types of information opportunities are great, but information that is not used is not really very useful. And so we hope that these types of gatherings can mobilize people to take the next step. And it could be just making phone calls. It could be just doing that. And I remember talking to a couple of members of staffers in Congress, and they're saying that they receive one of the reasons why a lot of members of Congress try to stay away from the Israel-Palestine stuff is because the other side just floods the hell out of them and they can't do any other work. They literally can't do any other work. And I said, well, what does flooding mean? I mean, they said 1,000 letters. I don't know if anybody has been listening to the Bauman Bush new podcast that is on Zateo. It's a great podcast. Jamal Bauman and Corey Bush have banded together to create this monthly podcast, and they just dropped the first one a couple of days ago. And it speaks specifically about the inner workings, the sausage making in Congress, because they both came out of that, and can tell us so much that is underneath the surface that I think can help us to build movements that are effective, especially as it relates to the legislature. So thank you all very much. We're going to have Norman Finkelstein tonight at 5 o'clock. We want you to come a little early because we're getting rumblings that there may be some protests outside, whatever. This is the Batar Worldwide group, which tends to be very violent, and not, in rhetoric, certainly. I don't know about the other stuff, but certainly in rhetoric. And they have put out a thing where saying, like, bring beepers or something like that to allude to what happened, of course, to Hezbollah and the beeper, explosions. And I think Norman Finkelstein, I saw a video of Norman Finkelstein walking in the street in New York where somebody ran up to him and dropped a beeper in his pocket. It was a toy beeper, but nonetheless, that's assault. So I've reported them, this group, to the FBI, actually. I was able to get through and report them to the FBI, and they have been put on notice. So I want to make sure that we don't say, oh, they're just crazy, we ignore them. No, let's go offensively and make sure that these people don't get the chance to continue to do all the shit that they're doing. Yes? Well, the event starts at 5. If you get here before 4:30, maybe 4:30, it'd be great. FYI, for the people that are here, I'm going to give you a little insight. Norman will be on this stage. So, I'm sorry?
You've done that before.
Oh.
Say it from here to me.
No, he's actually going to be here. We decided to have him here just to see maybe not enough people may show up or something like that. We don't want to have to put him there and have it be not as well attended, but also I think it's a little bit more comfortable for him to be there than to be there knowing Norman. So I think it'll be fine just being here. So we'll try to pack this room as much as possible and then build out to the outside. Thank you all for being here. And John, this is probably one of the best lectures we've had. We've had some great speakers throughout, but wouldn't you agree this was probably one of the best ones, I think. When I was thinking of doing this series, this is exactly what I had in mind. Someone who's really, has done a deep dive into this topic and be able to share that information and really give us real tools to be able to use in conversations that we have with others or in opportunities that we get that we can expound on what you said. So thank you very much. And especially to us, thank you.
Well, that was super, Josh. Thanks so much. Holy smokes. Wow. Stiff. Hello. Okay.
Does this have all the information about me? Oh, okay. What about your book talk?
Oh, yeah, that's 6:30
Tonight?
Where's yours?
Any other times in the area?
Yeah, I'm not scheduled now, but there will be.
Okay. Is there, do you have a website?
You sign up, so you have my email.
Okay, so I can sign up for more information. I really would like to come to. I'm just voting. So I'm in an auditorium.